Welcome back to the Exchange Server 2016 course on transport services. This is our last module, and now we're going to talk about anti-spam. Anti-spam is one of those things that really irritates a lot of users, including me. I hate receiving spam. You know, where did they get my email address? Did I once sign up for a newsletter and they leaked my email address to other companies and so on? So it can really distract users from doing work because you have to evaluate messages and check if those messages are valid, and you have to make sure that this is not legit emails and so on. So spam can actually be impact productivity in an organization. So let's get started. So in this course, we're going to look at how anti-spam works, the filtering features that's available in Exchange. And then we're going to look at how those spam features are applied in Exchange Server. So we'll talk about all of the different filters that is available in Exchange, and then end with some best practices on an anti-spam solution and what you should do in your organization to make the pain go away so that users never see spam. Now, obviously, what I'm saying now is actually impossible. You know, there's always going to be some spam messages that comes through to the organization, and you have to teach your users to be a little bit tolerant and say, you know, forgive me if some messages do come through, but you rather want to err on the side where messages come through that may have been not spam than blocking messages that you think is spam but it wasn't spam. So it's one of those things where it's a difficult balance to find. So let's start with first lesson, where we talk about the anti-spam solutions and how those features work in Exchange 2016. So the first thing that you have to remember is there's many filters in spam, and when you look at a message, there's a couple of things that you can deduce from a whole message to detect and to inform your decision if a message is spam or not. And the first thing that typically you know about a message is the sender or the recipient of that message. That can help you determine if this is spam or not. Normally, when somebody is sending a message to a recipient that doesn't exist, you know that this sender is just trying to guess people in your address book, and so it's just sending messages to random people in your organization. So recipient filtering is a very important concept that helps you to block messages, because if you receive messages for recipients that doesn't exist, then you're wasting bandwidth. So Exchange allows you to set up recipient filtering, and in the SMTP protocol, usually the first thing that Exchange does is it says when it connects on SMTP, any SMTP sender, it says this mail is from this person and it's for this person. This is the recipient of that message. At that point in time, you can already determine, so there's basically only a few bytes that went over the network. You can now determine whether or not you want to see anything about the rest of the message, because you know if this recipient exists or don't exist. So recipient filtering is a great feature to say, this user doesn't exist, invalid user, I'm not going to allow you to send the rest of the message. So it's a nice feature. Now, some people have pointed out that this very feature of the recipient filter causes the sender to actually harvest your directory, because I can make a connection to your SMTP server and I can try different combinations. So I'm going to type one name and see if that works. If I know that works, then I know this is a valid sender. And then if it doesn't work, then I'm going to guess another name and see if that is a valid sender. And Exchange has built-in protection to stop those directory harvesting attacks, and that's a feature called tar pitting. And in tar pitting, every time a sender is invalid or a recipient is invalid, it will delay that response with a couple of seconds, and it will increase that response, and the sender would then actually give up and say, you know, this method of doing a directory harvesting attack is really not useful to me. I'm going to give up because it's going to take me years and years to harvest the whole directory. So targeting is the way of slowing down that harvesting attack. You also have sender filtering, and this is really when you want to block certain senders. So maybe you have some experience of your environment, and over the years you've discovered that there's a specific sender that always sends you mail, and it's really not what you want. So the sender filter is another mechanism that you can implement to prevent certain senders. So you block that recipient using the sender filter. Then we also have sender ID filtering. Sender ID filtering is a mechanism that allows organizations to tell other organizations that these are the authoritative servers that is responsible for sending mail. And this is what we call the SPF record that you create in DNS as a text record, and you tell other servers that my servers that's responsible for my domain are these servers with these IP addresses or these host names. So if you receive any emails from other hosts, then it's not me. So you may want to block those messages and not accept them. So sender ID filtering is another mechanism that is implemented in Exchange to protect you against spam. And this is really something that you may want to opt into. You may want to also create your SPF record in DNS and advertise to the world so that you have a good reputation and people can use that information to evaluate mail from your organization. Another option is the sender reputation filtering. So Exchange uses information that it gathers over time from servers that sends messages to it to determine if this message is a spammy or spammy server. So it looks at what comes to that server and over time sees, oh, I'm actually getting a lot of spam messages from the server. Exchange will also do an open relay check with that sending server from time to time to see, what if I sent this server a message that doesn't, from a domain that doesn't exist, and I see how it reacts, and if it does allow that message to come through, then I know this is maybe a compromised server and there's open relay, anonymous open relay configured on that server, and spammers are using this server as a hop to send messages to other servers around the world. So maybe I want to block the sender from sending mail. So sender reputation filtering does that. It will gather that information over time and then assign values to this server to determine if it's a spam, a server that's compromised, or it's a known spammer. Then one of the other options that you have in Exchange Server 2016 is content filtering. Content filtering is of all these mechanisms the most CPU intensive mechanism, because at this stage it's going to scan the content and it's going to look for words and patterns and so on of email messages that looks like spam. So it's going to find things about, you know, pharmaceutical ads and so on that you want to block potentially. You know, maybe it's newsletters. So it's going to look for certain words. Maybe it's about gambling or so on, and you want to protect your environment from those. So content filtering is the most CPU intensive step, because that's where it needs to scan the message and look at the message content to find if there's any messages in there. Another option is to look at connection filtering. Connection filtering looks at the IP address. And this is a feature that you can enable on your edge server. So the edge servers can do connection filtering where it evaluates the IP address of the server connecting to it. And this is where it uses RBLs to check
real-time block lists.
Real-time block lists to check if the IP address is a known spammer. So what the RBL lists, like Spamhouse and so on, provides is the ability for you to do a DNS query with that IP address. So it's like a reverse lookup. And you say, give me an IP address for this, the status almost of this IP address. And it gives you a couple of responses. One of the responses is, we know this IP address is a known spammer. So in those cases, you definitely want to block emails from that IP address because it's a known spammer. It's a compromised host. Another status that it return is it can tell you that this is actually a IP address that is used for dynamic ISP allocations of clients. So it's not for servers, it's for end users. And sometimes end users is sent spam as well if it's a bad end user. So you want to maybe block those dynamic IP addresses as well and not allow email messages from them. And then you also have a category for open relay servers, so servers that is open relay. So it's not a known spammer, but it's just a host that is compromised. And you may want to decide to block some of them and or allow others of them, but I would block any of them that's got any of those three conditions because they are likely to be spam, highly likely to be spam. And then we also have attachment filtering. A Exchange can detect attachments in messages and see if any of those attachments are things that you want to block. Maybe you want to block certain messages with graphics attached to it, or maybe there's a message that's got a compressed file attached to it and you want to explicitly block those attachments, and it will be able to detect those attachments and block it for you.
So everything you talked about is all these different spam filtering technologies are available on the edge server role. On the mailbox server role, you have the ability to do sender and recipient filtering, content filtering, sender reputation filtering, but only connection filtering and attachment filtering. Those are the only two that are only available on the edge transport role.
Yeah.
And I also understand that this is not configurable in the UI?
Yes. So in Exchange, if you want to configure these things, you have to configure them in the Exchange management shell. So this is PowerShell commands where you have to go and create the configuration items or change the configuration items and so on. So one of the things that you typically want to set is the spam confidence level. So one of the things that the content filter does, when it receives a message, it goes through that message content and gives it a SCL value or spam confidence level. And then it gives it a rating from 0 to 9. 0 means it's definitely not spam. 9 means it's definitely spam. And there's one more level called -1, which means it's authenticated. So when it's a message is -1 means that it's sent internally and it was authenticated, and I'm going to trust that message. But so the content filter assigns a value from 0 to 9, and then you can decide how you want to react to that 0 to 9 value. If it's 9 or 8, maybe you want to block that message. You want to not even deal with that message in any other hop inside of your organization. So you're just going to silently, you accept that message and you block it because you know it's spam. You don't want to tell the person that it's spam and retry or anything like that. The next level is to reject that message. So you receive this message and you reject it. So you tell the person that's sending this message that I'm not going to accept this message because it's spam. So it's part of the header response that you give back to the user. You tell that user, that sending server, that I've detected something spammy about this message. I'm not going to accept it. And so therefore, this server knows that it have to do something about it. So maybe it's going to report that back to a user that sent that message so that he changes the message content so that it can go through again as a normal message. You can also say a level after that I want to accept this message, but I'm not going to deliver it to the user's inbox. I'm going to deliver this message to his junk mail folder. And so then the user has got some place where it can decide, I'm going to evaluate this message and say, oh no, this is my friend, you know, he's just being funny. And I can then move that message myself and say, this is a safe sender, I'm fine with this message. And then from that day on, it will be delivered to my inbox directly. You can also, before it goes to the junk mail folder, you can deliver this message to a quarantine mailbox to say to the user that I've quarantined this message. We think that it might be spam. We don't want to worry you. If you think it's not spam, let us know and we can release this message from the quarantine. So that's another level. And then if it's messages that are 0 or 1, then it's likely not spam, and you will just deliver that directly to the Exchange system or to the inbox. So it uses a lot of these filters together to determine the content filter, and maybe it failed some of the other filters to determine the spam confidence level. And depending on the spam confidence level that is finally assigned to that message, you can then decide how you're going to deal with that message. Maybe you want to reject it, or you want to quarantine it, or you want to send it to the junk mail folder, or you want to deliver it to the inbox. So you can decide on which level, and maybe in some organizations you have to make this really aggressive, and in some organizations you can relax it a bit because some users want to get some of those spam messages and order things online. So that is how the content filter works as well. But when it comes to anti-spam, we have to think about the best practices of anti-spam. So some things that you can do with anti-spam, again, in terms of best practices, is deploy Exchange Online Protection. Try and get rid of spam even before it hits your server. So if you point your MX records, just like the antivirus side, where you say you point your MX records to Exchange Online Protection, it first comes to them, they remove all the spam, and then you only get the clean stuff. So that is a good best practice that companies can implement.
And another option that does the same thing, it's multi-layered protection, would be to deploy a SMTP gateway in the perimeter network.
Yeah. So SMTP gateway is another way to shave off. So you think about all these email messages that's coming from the internet. You know, millions of messages that's heading towards your organization. Historically, we know that 95% of those messages are going to be spam, and you want to shave off the spam messages from that onslaught of messages as soon as possible. And so you want to start with a mechanism that is really efficient, that can detect spam messages as soon as possible, like content filter. So just based on the IP address, it's very efficient, and it will shave off, say, 80% of the messages. It came from bad IP addresses, so I'm going to reject those immediately. Then after that, you sit with the 20% messages, and your SMTP gateway solution will be able to look at the recipients maybe, or it will look at the content or something like that, and it will shave off the other 15% of messages to remove that from the bad or the good messages, so that you only get the good messages. So think about the funnel of messages that come in. You want to start off with really effective ways of shaving off bad emails from good emails, like content filters, and then less effective, where you need to look at recipients, you need to look at the message headers and things like that. And then finally, you use the more expensive mechanisms like content filtering, where you go into deep analysis and you look for certain words and patterns inside of the emails to shave off those final bit of email messages. And then you may end up with a few messages that you don't know how to deal with, and you can make that the user's problem. And usually, you know, if it's in the junk mail, they don't mind. You can expire those messages automatically with message retention to remove them automatically.
Other than that, I mean, the best practices pretty much mirror what we recommend for best practices for antivirus. You want to keep your anti-spam definitions up to date. Just like with antivirus, you want to monitor the anti-spam reports that are generated. You want to be aware of up and coming threats that are out there, and regularly evaluate end users' feedback.
Yeah, it's a really good idea to have your ear on the ground to make sure that if people saying, "Oh, I'm getting a lot of spam this week," maybe you have to change your configuration because there's a lot more spam coming in, or your spam signatures are not up to date. So then you can react to it. So it's always a good idea to talk to your users and to know what's going on. So that wraps up our session on Exchange Server 2016 Transport, and specifically antivirus, and it also wraps up our course. So we want to thank you for watching this, and we want to again invite you to look at the EDX courses. There's courses on Exchange infrastructure, client access services, mailbox databases, and transport. Thank you very much for watching. Joe, final word from you?
Thank you, Martin. This is great. I had a lot of fun.
Okay, good to have you here.
Thank you.